Well, it's the top of the hour, so I'm thinking that we should begin. My name's Dr. Lisa Durf. I am introducing your keynote speaker. Thank goodness I'm not delivering it. Dr. Bryan Alexander is a futurist who predicted this pandemic that we're experiencing right now in his book, Academia Next, which was published in 2020, and he did so on page 23. He works at Georgetown University. He's the host of the weekly Trends Forum. He is the chief cat herder in his house. CV is very impressive, and you can read more about his exploits at his site, which I hope is being put into the chat, bryanalexander.org. Now, I present to you Dr. Bryan Alexander.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Just a quick sound check. Can everyone hear me? Oh, look at all that ASCII applause. Woo. Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you all. Oh my gosh. Thank you all. That sounded like a baby. I'm delighted to be here. First of all, I want to thank Lisa for the incredibly kind introduction. Lisa is someone who has been a good friend, a good ally, a good supporter, and an awful lot of fun in conversations and discussions. And I envy you the chance to talk with her as well. I also want to thank my splendid Lori Von Luster, who has been just an enormous help in getting everything to work, and especially getting me an appropriate beard. So this is actually not too far off from the beard I currently sport. So please, a round of applause for LV. And I have to say, it's also a pleasure to be here in Second Life. I started teaching with and researching virtual worlds back in the 1990s, back in the days of MUDs and MOOs, back in the days Alpha Worlds, for those who might remember that. I think I taught my first class around 1995, 1996. It's just a lot of fun to be back here and to see all of you. I'm especially glad to see you all taking such a creative stance, literally. Some of you floating in space. It's wonderful for me personally as a point of style to see people really being creative and new ways of space that isn't really reproduction of. Now, I'm going to be talking about a whole range of topics. My goal is to make you think a little more creatively, a little more strategically about the future of higher education. And in order to do that, I'm going to cover a lot of ground. So let me just make sure first that you can see this big slide behind me. And again, my kudos to LV for making. I make a lot of media. As Lisa kindly mentioned, I handle the Future Trends Forum every week in video. I write a lot of articles. I have a series of books. My most recent book, Academia Next, is all about the next generation of higher education. Dive deeply into a whole series of trends and topics, and we're going to discuss some of them. But also, as Lisa pointed out, when I try to get people to think about the future of higher education and where it could be, early on in the book, I asked people to think about different possibilities for where the world could go and how the world could change and how that might impact colleges and universities. And so one of the ways I asked people to think was what would happen if a pandemic struck the world. And this is the now notorious page 23. I asked people to imagine the pandemic on the scale of the 1918 Great Influenza. I asked people to imagine how that would change things from online teaching to athletics to demographics. And nobody mentioned this page to me until about a year and a month ago. And ever since then, people have been asking me, what kind of dark forces am I in league with? What did I know and why did I know it? The fact is that in the futures world, we've been thinking about pandemics for quite some time, dating back to the 1990s, and in fact earlier. We've been doing role playing, we've been doing exercises and tabletop simulations, making media. And the pandemic is a prompt I've used in classes before. Unfortunately, not enough people listen to us. But now, of course, thanks to the reality, we are thinking a great deal more about what this means and where we could go. But before I go further, let me just ask if people could really, really quickly in the chat just say, what is your connection to higher education? If you can just put in, type in, I'm a professor of French, or I'm a student, or I'm the president of a university. Nothing, I just visit the campus down the block. All right, so far we've got some profs in geography, biology, English, that's a dangerous one. A distance learning librarian, fantastic. Spanish, hello Callisto. My Spanish is very, very basic. I'm working on it. I can now say, yo estudio español. People doing ESOL, more people for English, definitely dangerous people. Hello Jazz, an academic librarian. That's great to see. Inquisitive Loon, I think, is probably the most honest one here, a visiting extraterrestrial. And Slayton, glad to hear you're still a learner. Glad to hear you're still a learner. Well, I'll try and keep this in mind as I proceed, because I have an awful lot of ground to cover. Sheila, please say hi to my friends in Sheffield. I haven't been there, but I've known a bunch of folks there. And Zuri Avian, good to see you as a library visitor. And Fly's music teacher, fantastic. We have a bunch of trends to cover. And these trends are forces in the world that impact and reshape higher education. And these are trends that we can analyze, that we can test, that we can see. We have a lot of evidence for them. And then we can extrapolate what they will do going forward. So I'd like to begin with the first trend to talk about politics, because I'm one of those terrible people who never learned the lessons of Thanksgiving dinners. I start off right away with geopolitics and what it means. So, an important thing about higher education that doesn't get nearly enough attention is over the past generation, higher education worldwide has become more worldwide. We have been thinking and acting in a more global way than ever before in the history of higher education. And this means in part that we've had more students crossing more borders. You can really see this in Europe and the higher education area there. But American higher education, as well as British, Australian, and Canadian, have all been recruiting more and more international students. In the United States, the largest populations come from China, followed closely by India, as well as others in Central and East Asia. And this is a wonderful, wonderful development. And something similar has happened with research, in that we have more and more international collaboration, especially in the sciences and also the social sciences, as we have teams that cross national borders using the technology that makes this all possible. Now, all of this is very, very interesting and really points, however, in two different directions because of what's happened over the past 5 years. Now, all of this internationalization has yielded a kind of pushback. And you can think of this dialectically, where you have an idea that takes hold and then it elicits its opposite response. So if you imagine these two ideas going forward, I call one of them global university. And I'd like you to imagine Sheffield University or the college down the street. And it's one where if you set foot on it physically, which we will do again at some point, or if you set foot on it virtually, you will see people from multiple lands. You'll hear multiple languages. You'll see multiple ethnicities. Perhaps you'll see evidence of multiple styles of clothing as well as religion. It'll really be a kind of node representing the world. And then all the classes will reflect that as well, where the curriculum and the research point to the global direction. And this is one way forward. Now, the opposite move is what I call national or local university. And this pushes back and suggests that instead we should focus our curriculum and our research on local needs, on local cultures, on local features, and local resources. And we've seen this around the world, from Hungary and Poland to India, Brazil, to Turkey, and the United States. And it definitely ties into larger political concerns. You could see, for example, Erdogan in Turkey saying, emphasizing local Islam, emphasizing Turkish nationality. You could think about the government in India, which is emphasizing Indian traditions. Or you could think about the United States, where we've had several different presidents, Bush II as well as Trump, urging us to think about the United States and serving American students. You can imagine that future where campuses are more local, where English is not the language of instruction. And you can imagine them being places that are really paying attention to local curricula. So, for example, you can imagine more classes in local folklore, in local languages, in local history. And these two are in tension, and they oppose each other, but we can see both of them at play in different institutions as well as in different nations. I want you to think about that when you think about a venue like Second Life, or when you think about doing your work as librarians or technologists or faculty, that there's international versus national higher education. Both of those forces are in play. And they actually changed over the past year because the pandemic clobbered so much international travel, of course. And we've seen this really hit some nations. Australia, for example, lost about 1/3 of its student body because of China. We saw that in the United States. And in fact, only one country has really become the world's leader on a per capita basis in recruiting international students. Just throw this in the chat. Which country do you think that is? Which nation is the one that recruits the most international students on a per capita basis? Edith nailed it right out of the gate. Serena, good idea. New Zealand is fantastic, but no. Slayton, Estonia does amazing stuff, but it is Canada, the world's best friend, and Canada continues to do that, which is just, as a big fan of Canada, I'm impressed by this. But you think about that representing one path forward, but then also think about Hungarian universities operating in another one. I want to add one more feature of geopolitics here, and forgive me if this is a slightly U.S.-centric idea, but I don't really think it is. One of the big geopolitical impacting the future of higher ed is the growing tension between the United States and China. And this is going to have global impacts, and already is. That is, in the United States, there's a bipartisan consensus that China is the great strategic adversary of the United States. Huge call for what some call a whole of government response or a whole of society response. There are calls to take higher education and make it part of this. China has operated Confucius Institutes in the United States. Many of them have been closed. There have also been calls for certain fields of research to be closed off to Chinese students. And it's quite possible that we will see this escalate, that we will see pressure on American researchers not to collaborate with Chinese researchers, and the reverse, pressure from the Chinese government on Chinese researchers. It's not just these two countries, but China has, of course, its global network of One Belt, One Road, as well as allies it's trying to cultivate. And the United States is also recruiting more allies, especially Australia, Japan, South Korea, and India. So you may see a kind of Cold War 2.0 at a global scale, led by Beijing and Washington, D.C., which plays out and impacts what we do in higher. So keep an eye on that moving forward. Now, you should see a graph up ahead that shows a kind of pyramid. And one of the reasons this is here is because one of the most powerful tools in the futurists' toolkit is demographics. And the reason is, we know an awful lot about populations. We know a lot about births and about deaths. We know a lot about reproduction. And in fact, we have so much information, so much data, that once we know something about a generation, we can track it moving forward pretty well. And in fact, there's a whole branch of futures thinking which just focuses on generations. I don't partake of that, but it is very popular. And a lot of people who are baby boomers will really enjoy this, and perhaps millennials will follow suit. I want to focus on something different instead. If you see on the screen behind you, you can take a look at one of the most powerful transformations of our time, one that we don't really pay anywhere near attention. What you're seeing is a population diagram of the nation of Nigeria. And this is what a lot of the developing world looks like, and this is what most of human history looked like. If you look from bottom to top, what you see are slices of population by age. And you can see that at the very bottom, age 0 to 4, then 5 to 6. You can see a society that produces a lot of kids. What the great science fiction writer Neil Stephenson referred to, spamming the environment with babies. But you can see that mortality sets in year by year, cohort by cohort, so that you have more kids than you have teenagers, more teenagers than middle-aged people, more middle-aged people than retirees, and very, very few elders. And this kind of demographic explains actually a lot of our behavior and a lot of our culture's history. This helps explain the veneration of elders in quite a few tribal societies and in Confucius. And this is, again, what most of human history looked like until just recently. Now, what you should see is instead a diagram of the future. And this is what Germany looks like, or looked like last year. You can see that that pyramid has been flipped upside down, where there are some kids, more teenagers than kids, more adults, and a growing number of seniors. How has this happened? This has happened because of modernity. In the course of the 20th century, we've had some enormous developments. We've had breakthroughs in healthcare, breakthroughs in public health, and especially we've had more and more women having access to education and more access to reproductive capacity. So those of you who work in education know that you played a part in transforming humanity's demographics. Basically, we're having fewer kids. And as a result, we're having more and more adults and more seniors. Our median ages are climbing up. And you can track this through some pretty key data. You can see this, for example, in the number of kids that women have. In traditional societies, that number can be 6 to 10 in a lifetime. Drops to 2. Below 2 is below replacement level. So if women have fewer than 2 kids each, then a society shrinks. And many of these societies are now in 1.5, 1.6 territory. You can really see this in Japan and South Korea. You can see it in Finland. It'd be really visible in the US if we didn't have so much immigration. But this is transforming the world in all kinds of ways. Everything from culture to the possibility that we'll be less likely to fight war. You should Google the phrase geriatric peace. But also in education. So much of higher education is mentally centered in the idea of teaching 18-year-olds, traditional age undergraduates. But the pipeline to that population is starting to slow and starting to falter. Now, the only areas in the world that are still producing those children are mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as parts of Central Asia. So if you want to recruit more of those teenagers, you're going to have to recruit more from those nations. Interesting. We also have to think what this does to our curriculum, our marketing and outreach. Are we going to start teaching more and more adults? And some schools already do that. Are we going to target seniors, elders, retirees, people who have more time to be able to learn? This really transforms higher education as we know it. And it's something that we really, really need to think about. And we think about this in terms of design, think about this in terms of accessibility. There's all kinds of features. In the chat, one person mentioned water access, and I did want to make sure that we hear that because that's really, really important. We're going to come back to that when we touch on climate change. I think that's especially important. Eric Mondrian keeps noting that their universities have more grad students than they have undergrads. Yes, indeed. We will see more and more of that. In the U.S., thanks to COVID, I'll get to this, we saw their undergraduate population drop, but the graduate population grow. So you can see more and more of that. Again, that's a transformation of higher education. It's a deep transformation that's going to... Now, the slide in front of you should now also show an interesting chart about racial backgrounds. And I want to point this out for the United States because this is something that's very contentious in the U.S. What we're seeing is an interesting change as well, primarily from two major populations. The Anglo-Caucasian white population is dropping steadily, and depending on how you count this, at some point it will drop below 50%. And this is extraordinary in American history because we've had something like 90+% of our population white for decades, if not centuries. That has been dropping. The second part of this is the huge growth in our Latino population. This is the second biggest population in the United States. It's continuing to grow. And that will become an incredibly important part of American higher education. So we're already starting to think, how do we support Latino students? What is different about, what do they bring to the table that is different? What are their different needs, their different assets? How does that change higher education? And we're just starting to look at that. Now, the black population is stable at about 12.5 or 13%. And of course, in the United States, and we'll come back to this, that's politically very, very important right now. We're also seeing our Asian population continue to grow. It doesn't usually get enough attention, doesn't normally get enough tracking in the data. It's smaller than the black population, probably roughly 4.5, 5%. That's also continuing to grow. So what you're seeing is the United States that may be a majority-minority nation, and in higher education, that really changes what's up. One more feature to point out that's really important is that all of these people, regardless of their age, regardless of their racial background, worldwide are living in cities. The majority of the human race is now, for the first time in human history, urban. This is really, really strange. You have to really grapple with how odd this is. If you go back to the 19th century and human history, the whole gamut of it, up until about 1900, super majority of humans lived in rural areas. We were predominantly countryside-based civilization. We are now predominantly urban. All the cultural tensions you can think about between city mouse and country mouse, all of the tensions involved, all the transformations are now playing out. And the changes are accelerating. Worldwide, rural areas are becoming poorer, they're becoming older, they're becoming politically more conservative, and partly as a result, you're seeing cities becoming larger and the rate of growth accelerating. So that is producing a very, very different kind of society and culture for us to think about. We really haven't thought this through carefully. We have a lot of ways of thinking about rural features. I'm very fond of the idea of the countryside becoming a wonderful place to site post-carbon energy sources, predominantly and solar. But right now, that's a subject which every nation is thinking about. When it comes to higher education, we're already seeing this with rurally based colleges and universities being concerned about their enrollment, what they have to offer. All of these are deep, deep changes that are transforming the world. These are ones that are just kind of baked in and really can't. If I just see this in the chat, if you just quickly toss in, do you right now live in the city or the country? And if you live in a suburb, please put in city. Well, that's tracking on pretty closely. Diana, yes, that's it's an interesting question in Central Europe. How many of the rural areas are deeply intertwined or just so close to urban areas. One key point of this that Shiloh Emmons mentions is that Shiloh mentioned we are losing our food producers, and that's definitely true. In part, thanks to technological innovation, where we're able to produce more and more food involving fewer and fewer laborers. And again, so if you look back to the 19th century, the majority of the human race worked in agriculture, straight up. If you look at, say, World War I, that was predominantly fought by farm laborers, which is something that we really don't think about. But we're also losing touch with our food supply. We're losing touch with how we make food and what it means. And this has led to some very, very interesting cultural dynamics. Okay. Next slide, please. Yeah, there's quite a bit of conversation here about monocropping. Agreed. And it's a very, very fragile system in all kinds of ways. But now let's move on by zooming in to the question of what happens to higher education. We've had some interesting changes. What I'd like to show you now is a transformation that's happening, and the example I'm giving you is from the US, but this is really occurring worldwide in every continent that I've examined. So very, very basically, and for a couple of decades now, we've had a shift towards the sciences and away from the humanities. We've had a huge shift towards STEM in general, so including mathematics. Allied healthcare has been enormously popular in the United States, in part because our sector is the finances for our sector is deeply messed up, but also because we had more and more elderly people. And just statistically speaking, the older you get, the more healthcare you consume. Meanwhile, the humanities and the arts have been losing enrollment. Now, you can see exceptions to this in different individual campuses. You can see a lot of energy in the humanities, but generally speaking, we're shifting towards STEM. And we're also seeing economics and business being just enormously popular of all the social sciences. Next, following that, is psychology, which is interesting because the psych field as a research enterprise is having a lot of problems. As a professional field, there's enormous demand for psych, and that's continuing to grow. But just think about this in terms of what professors we hire, what classes we teach. I mean, I'm speaking to you as a humanist. My PhD is in English language and literature. I don't say this with any great degree of celebration, but it also means the humanities have a fight on their hands if they want to actually persist in their present form. It's possible that we'll see the humanities dwindle into being a service sector, focusing on more basic or general classes. It's possible that we'll see all kinds of problems with sciences that don't have enough infusion in the humanities. At the same time, we could see some serious anti-science stances within the humanities. What C.P. Snow called the two cultures split may become very, very deep. Nahala Ralfi, if I mispronounced you, please forgive me, says that they are teaching at a liberal arts college. It's been horrible watching liberal arts being dismissed and dismantled. Indeed. But right now, the numbers behind that are very, very strong. Again, when I'm talking about trends, when I'm talking about forces, these are general forces operating at macro level with local exceptions. And I'm not saying these to celebrate them necessarily. I'll tell you when I celebrate them. But these are forces that are already in play. You need to pay attention. Eric Mondrian mentions the shift from STEM to STEAM. I've been hearing this most of my life and seeing actually very little of it. We need to see more of it if we're going to be taking that seriously. Jazz Beverly mentions a father with a PhD in philosophy taught in business because they were hiring. The philosophy department was shrinking. D.D. Baker has a nice phrase. A humanities-science split is probably as bad as a mind-body split. Yeah, it's a kind of Cartesian error right there that we have to be very, very careful about. So keep an eye on this. Now, we have a lot of ground to cover, and I want to keep advancing on this. So I want to touch on a different point, one that is probably dear to a lot of your hearts, which is to discuss technology. Zinnia mentions Carl Sagan quotes. Good for you. Just a great hero. We have a lot to talk about when it comes to technology. Obviously, we can talk about virtual worlds. I don't need to tell you very much about them. But what I can tell you is that we should be thinking hard about automation. And I want to think about automation at the macro level right now. What's interesting is if you read accounts of automation, by automation I mean both physical hardware automation, robotics, as well as software, artificial intelligence and algorithms. If you read accounts and predictions of automation from, say, 1995 to 2010, they tend to fall short of the reality that we're experiencing. I mean, right now in 2021, we are living in an automation science fiction world. We're seeing robots being deployed around the world at war, for hostage situations, for natural disasters. We're seeing software make more content than humans do. We've already seen software alter the financial network of the world through high frequency trading. We've seen all kinds of impacts of this. And it's really continuing to grow. And it's really hard in some ways, to overestimate how much of an impact it can. Yes, there's a tremendous amount of hype. There's a huge amount of investment in this. There's also a lot of national security being invested. I mentioned the U.S.-China split. Part of that is occurring along the lens of automation. But I want you to think about this in an even bigger picture. What a lot of automation might do to our society. So we could think about it in a few ways. And one is that we can imagine that we get a lot of downtime as a result. I mean, ever since the industrial age began, people have predicted that automation would lead to unemployment. And it hasn't yet. From about 1850 to about 1990, whenever we invented a new technology that unemployed some people, we produced more jobs as a result. You think about the car and how that outmoded the horse and buggy, which was bad news for horse and buggy drivers and horse dealers and buggy makers. But we grew the automotive world, which is vastly, vastly larger. I lived for years in Vermont. Vermont had a business that some of you may have heard of, the ice business, where during springtime, people would cut big chunks of ice out of frozen ponds and ship them down to the American South to be used for refrigeration. Well, we invented HVAC, and that kind of clobbered the ice business. But the HVAC field was much larger. And again, we've repeated this pattern. But since 1990 or so, this pattern has not been happening. We've grown some enormous businesses that employ a lot of money. If you think about Apple, you think about Facebook, you think about Google, Amazon, Microsoft, these are enormous world-straddling businesses, but they actually employ very, very few people. Compare this to the 20th century and think about any industrial operation which really hires, a lot of people in order to work. We're not at that scale now. So it's possible that the next generation or so will see a shrinking of the amount of people working. And that might play out in terms of unemployment, where, say, for example, we could get used to having 10% unemployment. It could play out in terms of people exiting the workforce early, retiring early. Or it could play out in terms of underemployment, where people work, instead of 40, they work 30. Instead of 30 hours, they work 20 hours. That transformation plays a huge role in higher education, because one of our functions is to educate learners so they can go on to careers. But if those careers aren't as available, or if those careers are only part-time, then what is higher education for? Do we also prepare students for downtime? Is this where the humanities comes back, where adults who only work 25 hours a week will have time to consider Aristotle or to learn Japanese? Now, that is one possible future. Tizzy Canucci points out that we will also have the possibility of people who are underemployed or unemployed being marginalized even further. Tizzy resurrects the 19th century term of lumpenproletariat. See more and more of that happen, in which case higher education could play a role in worsening that divide, because we make people more educated, we give them more credentials, we give them a better shot at the economy, which may have a backfiring effect of more hostility towards the academy. Cat's not going to come back to your point in a sec, because this is a great point. Second possibility we have is that the digital world, the automation world, will follow what actually happened with the industrial world. That is, for every job we outmode, we create a new job. So we have jobs right now that are pure science fiction to the world 30 years ago. Think about social media influencers. Think about people who specialize in AI ethics. It's possible that we'll just transform the workforce And we'll have a whole new series of jobs based on the outcomes of automation, in which case higher education has to rethink what it teaches. Max Chatnor mentioned Zoom wedding platters, for example. So we have to think about some of these ways that we have to transform our curriculum as well as our research. Next slide, please, Elvie. The third possibility is that we'll have something like a synthesis, that we won't lead to widespread underemployment, that we won't lead to a massive wave of new jobs, that we'll instead see people working about as much in more or less the same jobs, but doing so deeply, deeply immersed with automation. That is, you think about people who work in security, who will be wrangling drones and robots. Think about people in poli-sci, who are going to have to get used to working with GIS and other mapping software. People working in literature and in foreign languages will have to do more with text mining, but also using AI. In fact, how many instructors will have an AI assistant who helps them analyze data about their class? How many researchers will use some form of AI, help them in their research, and in fact be cited as co-authors? So we could have a kind of synthesis that occurs where we are just working much more closely with digital technology. In which case, I submit that your experience here in virtual worlds is a fantastic training for that kind of world. In which case, you might be good guides to where that's headed. So, that's another possibility. And Cat's Eye mentions creativity. I think I've got that right, Cat's Eye. I forgot this wrong. Again, that's a place where we have to think about focusing on what technology can't do as well. Jazz Beverly mentioned that their great-grandfather wrote a letter to one of his sons, which he encouraged the recent college graduate to keep reading and thinking because he dug ditches in the EPA in the United States during the Depression in the 1930s. We may have more of a generational succession going on. Good points. Good points. And Shiloh has a fascinating idea. The arts may be produced primarily by older individuals, more than in previous centuries. So Shiloh, if I can just run with that for a second, this is fascinating. Imagine that we have people who retire a little bit earlier, so say it's 60, 55, who live longer, remember what I mentioned before about transformation, and who have more access to more higher education. So it may be that when they're not working per se at a paid job, that they are now in computer games, they're writing novels, they're making music, they're creating art forms that we're really even not completely conversant with right now. Think, for example, about drone-based art. So that would be fascinating. Edith will ask us to think of Yo-Yo Ma. Edith, if you want to see a bit more about that, that would be great. I'm an amateur cellist, so I'm always happy. Day Miami asks us to think about creativity as the main objective for education. Imagine what a curriculum looks like where creativity is the centerpiece of it. D.D. Baker asks us to remember critical thinking. The challenge of critical thinking, D.D., is not the definition of it, I think, is that we can't always rely on people to use it in a way. Xenia mentions that top job skills creative problem solving, which is a great point. And here I'll just give a shout out to the Future Problem Solving Group, which has been teaching kids how to think about the future for years and years. Edith mentions that Yo-Yo Ma he is older and he plays for the world during the pandemic. Very good. Okay. Now, in the interest of time, I want to push on and then push back in time. Let's take a look at the year 2020. Let's think about what we just experienced. And I want to hit on two things. I mentioned before that some of us have been thinking about the pandemic idea for a long time. And people say it's unprecedented, which is wrong. Pandemics have ample precedent. It just occurred to people. People experienced it as a kind of black swan, which is different. As an extraordinary change, which for many people is quite true. If you compare, for example, the responses of Brazil or the United States to the pandemic versus, say, Singapore or South Korea, That's because in Brazil and the United States, we literally experienced this as extraordinary. We haven't had a major pandemic like this century, whereas in Singapore and in South Korea, other nations, they've dealt with SARS or with MERS. Now, there's a lot we can say about the pandemic. We can speak about how it changed our society and perhaps turned us more into introverts. We will become more and more shy because we have a year plus of being trained to avoid people as a source of the plague, where we literally avoid people like the plague. We can speak about how this changes architecture, how we may see more windows, wider doors, bigger outside spaces, all kinds of changes. But I want to focus now on how this changed education. So first of all, for all of you who have had to deal with people saying education doesn't change, education hates innovation, education is inflexible, you can point to spring 2020 and say, bullshit. Because education transformed massively. We flipped millions of students, thousands of campuses, from face-to-face education being entirely online. We did that in weeks, if not days. We did it without any extra resources. Prof. Dan points out we didn't necessarily do it well. Absolutely. We did it as a shambles in a lot of places. We did it in a huge hurry because it was a crisis. But we actually did it. And we kept doing it. That is, we kept re-innovating and trying again to see what could work. We had people learning how to actually use a learning management system for the first time. We had people trying to figure out how to do video. And they made terrible mistakes. We all have seen this. We've all experienced it. But we fell down and tried again. That's the process of innovation, of trying and trying again. I mean, this past year and a half has seen massive amounts of death, huge amounts of suffering. I'm not going to discount that. I kind of focus on that all the time. But we also saw higher education respond flexibly, creatively, and with innovation. That is who we are. Yeah, we're also conservative. Yeah, we're the ivory tower. Yeah, we're slow to change. We now know with proof of life that we can do massive changes in a hurry. And we need to remember that. We need to own that, just in case anybody says we never change. Duncan points out, critical thinking problem solvers led the way. Exactly. And some interesting developments. Thinking about virtual worlds, we inhabited, in a sense, a lot of virtual worlds to do that teaching. We had the synchronous virtual worlds, mostly of video conferencing. We had the asynchronous virtual worlds of, learning management systems, discussion boards, email, Slack, WhatsApp, all kinds of things. But we created all of that. We inhabited all of that. We made that work to different degrees of success. And video really led the way. This is one of the things about technology now that we don't really appreciate fully, is that the most popular technology on earth right now seems to be video. Across all races, all ages, all education backgrounds, all economic classes, all nations, we absolutely love video. We love consuming video. We love making video. Streaming it, we love making things to fit into video later. Video is absolutely huge. And this is not necessarily a good thing for higher education, because this led smack into the digital divide, which for the first time in my life, people actually started thinking about in a serious way. Now, there's an interesting argument that maybe asynchronous teaching is actually better. Asynchronous teaching fits better into lives that are challenged by the pandemic, lives that are racked with economic chaos, with people who are busy with work. That asynchronous might be the more just response, and that maybe should be a kind of optional flavor. But that's the kind of thinking we've been doing for the past year. Tizzy Canucci points out that it's difficult to hear the audio because the big money was in visual video. Yeah, we tend not to pay enough attention to audio, generally speaking. I was delighted that the second wave of podcasts had become so popular. The first wave of podcasting, by the way, starts in 2004. But we tend not to pay enough attention to audio. Tizzy, my theory about this is because a lot of English professors became film critics starting in the 1940s. English professors are good at looking at text, so they look at dialogue, they can look at space, but we're not trained to look at audio. So we don't pay a lot of attention to sound quality, which is definitely a problem. Prof. Dan points out that asynchronous is great, but that synchronous creates community. Professor Dan, I would submit that both create community. They just do it with different affordances and in different ways. Think, for example, about non-synchronous social media. Think LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, and so on. That's a lot of ways of actually making communities happen. Think about all kinds of email-based communities. Beth Ghostraven, which is the best name I've seen to that. Homework used to be the asynchronous part that didn't work very well. Hopefully students are paying more attention to it now. Yeah, which leads to the flipped classroom in many ways. Edith, I agree. All communication can do that. Prof. Dan points out the sense of presence is stronger here than in Facebook. Yes, it definitely is. There's a lot more bandwidth, both literally and also just psychologically. When I see a comment on Facebook, even a well-written one that's a pretty narrow band, that's a bit of text, maybe there's an image to it. You can flash it out by clicking on some links. But audio, man, that adds just so much more, which is one of the reasons why people are so Clubhouse only. Podcast. Video is just great to add faces as well as spaces, being able to look into people's houses, which again has downsides as well, because not everyone can really share their space. Their space might be really stressed, or they can't handle the bandwidth for it. Tizzy adds, podcasting stepped into the space that's streaming abandoned, creating imagination and composition of LPs and radio. Agreed. A century plus, Tizzy, of audio innovation is right there. James points out, sings the praises of virtual worlds by saying that when he recalls a Zoom, he recalls sitting at a computer. When he remembers this event, he remembers being an auditorium. And James, I hope it's an auditorium where we're talking both back and forth and not just one way. One more point that I didn't want to lose from the chat, because the chat is fantastic. That Sheila points out sync and async can work in a complementary way. Exactly. And the question is, how do you balance them? And then the librarian Greg, I hope I pronounced that correctly, talking about meta-literacy. So this is the question of juggling multiple forms of literacy. Literacy of text, literacy of audio, literacy of visuals, so on. Zinnia is the futurist in the chat, who points out that their students want them to keep doing Zoom jam sessions. They love the engagement with it. Oh, I'm so glad that you're all contributing so much. I absolutely live for conversation. If we don't have conversation, we may as well just do a canned video, I think. Now, one more point about this and how this has changed us. We had to rethink quite a bit of what education is and how it works. So one part was thinking about the digital divide, and we haven't solved that. We've tried a lot of ways. Bowdoin College in Maine shipped students iPads stuffed with cell phone connections that were themselves in full subscriptions. We've seen tribal colleges and universities in the American West where they actually went back to paper and mailed people things. I've seen community college presidents drive buses with Wi-Fi attached into communities to float a cloud for them. And we've seen libraries, both academic and public, trying to, even when they're closed for face-to-face work, trying to float a cloud as far as they can so people can gather in their courtyards and in their parking lots and in their spaces in order to take advantage of that. But once again, librarians are just clearly heroes, unsung heroes of this crisis and this. Now, there's another aspect of 2020 that I want to bring up. And this started in the U.S., but then went a bit further. Starting in the summer of last year, the United States has gone through what some call a great awakening or a great awakening or a great reckoning on matters of race, specifically on anti-Black racism. And this is giving the whole nation a chance to rethink and start new practices on what's happening in terms of race and racism. Remember when I was talking about demographics? I mentioned the changes in our population mix. And again, this is a nation that is shifting away from being a majority white country. And now we're seeing cultural, political, social, and personal shifts to try to recognize that and to try to remove the pillars of racism. And we're seeing this play out throughout higher education. Everything from renaming buildings, colleges, tearing down monuments, putting up new ones, calls to decolonize curricula, changes in hiring, promotion, tenure, and review, both for faculty as well as staff, changes in how we support students. I mean, it's a whole social revolution happening right now, and it's spread to other countries. The United States has its own particular contours of racism, but we are by no means unique in structuring things along racial lines. So other countries now are starting to think about this. So this wave is sweeping higher education. For the past year at Georgetown University, I worked with a group called Higher Education's Big Rethink. And we looked carefully at what was going on in 2020. And we did a lot of work. We interviewed quite a few experts from around the world. We had a lot of graduate students do a lot of great work. And we published already our first book on this called The Openings. We're trying to look at the possibilities for change. And we found two that came out of these dual developments from 2020. One was this recommitment to racial justice. And this seems to be playing out right now in 2021. And we also saw a recommitment to improving teaching and learning. That while we were doing this combination of online learning along with hybrid and various forms of hybridity, including HighFlex, that we try to do it better. And this is where another hero of higher education is stepping into the limelight, which is instructional designers, who have been doing fantastic work. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to professors who last year said, I don't know how to teach online. I've never done that before. Where do I start? Instructional technologists say, don't worry. We've been working on this literally for decades. We have a generation worth of experiment, of practice, of scholarship, and lessons learned, and we know what to do. Instructional designers are fantastic. I've done a lot of work. So, quietly, we've kind of rethought the structure and the values of who matters in higher education. We've also thought about our people. And I want to just dwell on this for a minute. Because one of the reasons people get into higher education as professionals is because of the wonderful act of learning. This is really cheesy for me to say, but I think sociologically and psychologically this is very precise. That this is the only place in the world where adults get to focus for a lot of time or full time on learning and expanding their minds. And we devote ourselves to that extraordinary, wonderful experience. We do this as teachers, we do this as support in different ways, and it's a tremendous, tremendous thing to do. When the pandemic struck, it made us rethink how we do this. When Black Lives Matter re-exploded in June of 2020, it made us rethink things. In literary criticism, there's this phrase called defamiliarization. A Russian critic named Shklovsky came up with it. In Russian, it's called ostrony. And this is when you look at the same thing through fresh eyes. You can think of a stone becoming more stony. You could think about a person now coming to you vividly. And a lot of what happened was that in education, we had to rethink our students. We had to rethink how to support them. We had to rethink who they are and what we can do to help them. And I think one of the great developments is that we took that seriously. We're expanding our mental health provisions. And this is going to happen at a planetary scale. I mean, the human race just went through a species-wide trauma. So for the next N years, we're going to be dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder of various forms. So again, psychology is a field academically that's simply going to take off. You think about our students and how much they went through and how we have to care for them. Think about how many professors, how many classes, how many programs altered things like attendance taking, grading, altered curricula to adjust to their needs. when I mentioned before some of the downsides of Zoom or other forms of live video conferencing, trying to adjust to the fact that not everyone can do it, I think that's a wonderful thing. And I take a great deal of inspiration from that. Now, let's zoom out a little further. And I'm conscious of time, and I want to make sure that we are really just continuing to go forward. And I want to make sure also that I don't lose any comments from any of you.
Okay, but we are actually almost out of time because we have to move to the next session.
Can I at least show the climate change slide?
Yes, you may.
This is the thought to leave you with. On the one hand, the thought about our students and how extraordinary they are and the amount of work they did and the transformations they underwent. And the other thing to think about is a far greater challenge, a civilization challenge, a planetary challenge, where the world is going with climate change and how this impacts higher education from our physical campuses to our research, to our curriculum, to our politics, to how we support our communities. And this is the subject of my next book that I'm working on. But you want to look carefully at that because that's going to be a problem, a topic, a force that's just going to reshape everything we do. Because of time, I want to stop here. I want to thank you all for your very, very kind attention. I want to thank you for I want to thank you for your imagination, and I want to thank you for participating and contributing to this. I'd love to hear more from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander, for a wonderful presentation. And please move now to your next choice. And I think Laura Yvonne wants to say something. She's sighing.
Thank you, Bryan. Thank you, Edith. This has been tremendous. I'm getting suggestions that we need to have you back for a special session sometime.
I'd be delighted and honored. Thank you.